Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Idahoan Show. A while back I'd posted a video called Investigating the Legend, where I talked about my 350 Legend AR build, and at the end of the video I had a Legend rifle that was working okay. But that's been a while ago, and in the comments people lately have been asking, how's it going? Have you made any progress? How about an update? And the truth is, I haven't made a whole lot of progress, but I figured since it's been requested, I'll go ahead and give you a quick update. One thing I have done is a little bit more load development. As I recall, the first load that I'd worked up in that original video was, I think, 158 grain jacketed bullet at about 2,000 feet per second. And it's important to use a bullet with a drawn copper jacket and not just a plated jacket, because the copper plating will actually disintegrate in the barrel, and then that copper powder will vent into the gas system and clog up the bolt carrier group, as I think I did discuss in the first video. Anyway, I went on to work up a lighter, higher velocity load with 110 grain jacketed hollow point at 2,800 feet per second. And then I turned my attention to developing a cast bullet load, and this was a little bit more difficult. I wanted something that I could load with, hand-cast, powder-coated bullets to keep the cost of reloading 350 Legend down. And yet, what I found was that although I could get the load to function reliably in the gun, and cycle and feed about as well as my jacketed bullet loads, the accuracy was really poor. I was getting like a 3-foot group at 25 yards. And so I determined it was leading the barrel, even with a fully powder-coated bullet and a relatively hard casting alloy. But surprisingly, when I finally got around to trying a gas check on the bullet, just crimping a little brass gas check onto the base completely solved the leading problem and cleared up the accuracy. It went from a 3-foot group to like a 3-inch group. Moral of our story is, if you're casting bullets for use in the Legend or probably other rifles, the gas check is really important. In contrast to pistol ammunition, where usually a gas check doesn't make much difference in accuracy, at least in my experience. I think I posted my 350 Legend load data over on the Reloaders Network just in text format, not as a video. But that information is out there if anyone is interested. Now, at one point I also tried to work up a subsonic load for the Legend, and that didn't work out so well. I made a custom bullet mold so I could cast really long, heavy bullets, but I was never able to come up with a combination of bullet and powder charge that would actually cycle the action reliably with those exceptionally heavy bullets. And so that never really went anywhere. Now, the other issue that I tried to address was magazines. In the first video, I was still using these 20-round factory magazines because that was the best that I could find. In theory, the 350 is the same overall diameter as the 223, so you should have comparable capacity. In theory, you should be able to have a 30-plus round magazine for the Legend. But in practice, nobody seems to be making those commercially, and in experimenting with it, I kind of found out why. So I'm actually still using these 20-round magazines, but I tried making my own a couple of different ways. I experimented with 3D printing plastic magazines for the Legend. Initially, I went for just like a 5-round capacity magazine, so I could use less plastic as I was fine-tuning the shape of it to make it work. And eventually I did get the geometry of the feed lips and so forth figured out to where the magazines were functional, The trouble is that they were extremely fragile. They were basically one-time use magazines, and then they would fall apart. As you can see, this one of the feed lips is completely broken off and the other is badly cracked. And this is probably the most intact magazine body that I have left from that initial testing. So 3D printing was useful sort of for mock-ups and for figuring out the geometry that I needed, but not really useful for actually making functional magazines. So next I tried making a sheet metal magazine, and initially this didn't work at all because the feed lips that I just bent on it were not precise enough. So then I went back and I machined the feed lips to precisely the right geometry, and then this kind of worked. I was able to get it to feed, but the trouble then was friction. If you notice that a lot of factory magazines, either they're polymer or they're polymer coated, or they're made from very smooth, maybe chrome-plated steel, to help mitigate the effects of friction so the cartridges will flow and feed nicely. Well, this is just made from brushed sheet metal, and it doesn't feel like it's got much friction in it, but if I got more than about 5 cartridges in here, it wouldn't feed reliably. It would start sticking or lagging, and so it just, it looks like it should be a 30 or 40 round magazine, but functionally it's a 5 round magazine, because if I put more than 5 cartridges in it, it won't feed. I tried increasing the strength of the spring, and that's how I got to 5, but beyond that, again, the friction just kills you. So my attempts to make homemade magazines didn't really go anywhere, and for what it's worth, I'm still using the factory 20 rounders. Then the final issue that came up just in the course of all this testing was reliability. I had magazines that worked reasonably well. I had rounds that seemed to cycle the gun at about the right impulse to be reliable, but about 1 to 2 times per 100 rounds, I'd still get a round that would fail to cycle correctly. Either it wouldn't feed all the way into the chamber, or it wouldn't go quite all the way into battery, or something along those lines. And, that level of reliability is fine if you're just plinking, using the gun for casual target shooting, possibly for hunting, but, it's questionable if you were to use it in any kind of serious competition, and you definitely wouldn't want to use it for something like self-defense. So I spent a lot of time troubleshooting the reliability issues, both looking at the magazines, tweaking the loads, polishing the feed ramps, doing everything I could to try and maximize reliability. And the conclusion that I came to in the end was that a long, skinny, cylindrical cartridge like the Legend is just kind of a worst-case scenario for reliable feeding. It's very easy for a cartridge like this to tilt a little bit and get in a position where it binds instead of feeding cleanly into the chamber. As compared to something like a 223, where it's just as long and skinny, but it's much more tapered, and so it slides into the chamber easier, or something like a 45 auto or a 9mm that is much shorter, and so even though it's a cylindrical cartridge, it has to tilt at a pretty significant angle before it can bind. And so that was kind of where the 350 Legend project stalled. Certainly for me, and I think kind of for the whole firearms industry, because if you look at the literature on the Legend, it was originally introduced as a cartridge for the AR-15 platform. And in that role, it had a lot of advantages in theory, but none of those advantages mean anything if it doesn't feed reliably. And so what we've kind of seen is that since then, companies have, if anything, backed off on their support for the 350 as an AR platform cartridge. We certainly don't see them offering new higher capacity magazines and increasing their support for 350 ARs. Instead, what we see is a lot of companies now stepping in with bolt actions and other single shot type rifles in 350 where feeding and capacity issues are not going to be seen as a problem. So in conclusion, I would say that the 350 Legend is a very aptly named cartridge because, like so many legends, the reality doesn't quite live up to the story. It has a lot of advantages in theory that don't quite work out in practice. So that obviously was a little bit of a disappointment for me, but I've kind of moved on to other projects. This is what's left of my 350 Legend rifle. As you can see, I've cannibalized most of the parts for other builds. That said, I'm not totally done with this. I do plan on eventually rebuilding this. I have an idea for kind of a fun custom AR build to do with this, but I'm not really sure when I'll get around to it. So until then, thank you for watching the Idahoan Show.